Thinking about climate change issues right back on Earth Day #1 in 1970, when I heard that dust and smoke could cool the climate and CO2 and greenhouse gases could warm it, and it took us 3 or 4 years to know even whether warming or cooling would win. It became very clear by the mid and certainly by the late 70s that warming was going to win, but none of us win when that happens. It is now about 0.7 of a degree C warmer than it was a century ago, and that's included super fires in Australia. That's included the incredible, unbelievable heat wave in 2003 in Europe that killed 35,000 people, something none of us in our wildest, most exaggerated, fear-mongering, doom-oriented brains would have thought was possible in modern-day Europe. And we know that although nature was producing the heat wave, we added enough to it to really dramatically increase the damage. Then, of course, there was the super hurricane season in the North American Gulf area, with Katrina being the most famous, but that wasn't even the strongest storm. It was Wilma that was the strongest hurricane ever recorded in the Atlantic, and the recent evidence that both the Atlantic and the Pacific have had a substantial increase in Category 4 and 5. Those are the super wind hurricanes, just as theory told us. So what's happened since we started doing this in the 1970s and really started working on it in the 1980s? Frankly, there isn't a lot of new basic science. What's happened is that nature has started to cooperate with theory, and what has been predicted is happening, as well as some surprises we never expected, like super heat waves and the forest fire problems. So what's happened since 100 of us started worrying out loud in the early 1970s that dust could cool and greenhouse gases could warm? Well, the scientific community settled on warming by the late 1970s as more likely, although we were never sure it's going to be at the high side, and it was more catastrophic or at the low side. And what we've learned since is that nature has cooperated with theory, and that we now have about 0.7 of a degree more warming. That's already been enough to substantially increase the intensity of hurricanes, which were made very famous in the summer of 2005 in the U.S. Gulf Coast. That was sufficient, that it pushed over the top extreme heat waves to much more than they would have been, and the Euro catastrophe of 35,000 people dying of heat in 2003, and enhanced bushfires in Australia, and record heat and dry in Australia. And all of those were elements of the original forecast that we made boldly but cautiously. And we didn't promise, we just said, this is what we're doing. We're changing the roulette wheel. And what rational people do when you realize that there are uncertain things in life is you try to make the bad slots smaller, the good slots fatter. And what we're doing climatically is we're making the bad slots fatter and the good slots smaller, and that's just not very smart. And finally the world has got together and said, we know we have to slow this down, but there's some recalcitrants, in particular the federal governments in the United States and Australia, both of whom have said, well, the problem will be solved over 100 years by technology. Don't bother me to do anything inconvenient now. But they're swimming upstream against the behavior of cities and states and most nations in the world, and there will be an interesting political fallout as the last few holdouts finally begin to admit that we've got to do something about protecting the planetary life support system. I often get asked, well, are you optimistic or pessimistic? Aren't you just too depressed? I mean, you haven't been able to prevent the warming we've had so far. We've already had some really nasty outcomes, and we're now committed to 2 to 3 times more warming no matter what we do. Haven't we just lost? The answer is no, not at all. We're committed to probably 2 degrees or more, unless we do something. So let's not give up and say, well, we're stuck with 2 degrees, and 2 degrees has a lot of dangerous elements in it, so we give up. Not the way it is. Let's not have 3 degrees in 50 years if we can settle for 2 degrees in 100. That's a very big difference in how many species go extinct, a very big difference in how much we intensify hurricanes, a very big difference in the extreme drought and flood cycles that are going to get exacerbated by humans in Australia and in the US West and places like that. So that's what we have to work on, which is reducing the damages. Now, Again, are you a pessimist? Well, you could say it took an ozone hole to get our attention and finally start to ban ozone-depleting substances. You could be an optimist and say, well, we got an ozone hole and we did something about it. So the question is the world worried enough based upon the Euro heat waves and the North American hurricanes and the increasing intensity of droughts and floods in Australia, that it finally says, that's our climate hole, let's act on this. And I think we're on the border of that, but we still have some national politicians still protecting coal industries, still protecting manufacturers of supersized cars, and they are reluctant to get into the act, but they are changing their views as more and more events that occur start mobilizing the political world and many of their own parties' politicians to say, enough's enough, we got to do something. What are we going to tell our children and our grandchildren 50 years from now? We left them a little bit richer and gave them a dangerous world? I was once at a meeting, and I got asked when there was a minute left. I was one of 5 panelists, U.S. senators and business leaders. So what are the 5 worst global environmental problems? And the senator just racked them off: biodiversity protection and climate change and ozone and waste disposal and health. And he did a great job. Business person said we don't have enough investment capital, we're not providing the right incentives, and that was all right. The agricultural person said we are not distributing technology and we're not giving farmers the information to be protected so they can adapt to climate change. By the time they got to me, there was nothing left to say. The 5 worst environmental problems, I rolled my eyes, thought out loud, and I said, ignorance, greed, denial, tribalism, and short-term thinking. This was 15 years ago. I'm afraid to say not a lot has changed. But, and this is an important but, we have a Kyoto Protocol. It's not a very good protocol, but it's something. It's not about cutting greenhouse gases now or in any long-term meaningful way. It's about changing the paradigm. We are so good at competition and so bad at cooperation at an international level, yet we can't solve the problem of using the atmosphere as a free sewer for everybody to dump their wastes till we learn to cooperate. Remember, a ton of carbon injected in Beijing is no different from the ecological damage point of view than a ton injected in Brisbane or in Boston or in Brussels. It's all the same. So we're in this planet together, and we have to find cooperative solutions that are both cost-effective and fair. You cannot do what Australia and the U.S. federal government have done, which is to say, well, without China and India, it won't work, so we won't play. Let's not forget that China and India have 1/10 the energy use per capita that we do. We use the Victorian Industrial Revolution to get rich. They're playing catch-up. They have a right to be skeptical when we say, oh no, level playing field. They have to do it at the same time we do. And they say, you have a 100-year head start on us. You're richer. You use the combination of colonialism and market capital to get an advantage, our turn to catch up. And I say personally to Chinese and Indians at meetings all the time, so you're going to hold the world hostage to your notion of equity. That isn't much better than our saying level playing field when the playing field hasn't been level for 100 years. This takes enlightened statesmen. This takes leaders who care about both the planet as well as their country, and who are willing to make compromises in order to deal with each other, because if everybody says me first, we're going to end up with an amazing amount of warming. Leaders have to transcend simply producing for their best campaign contributors a healthy financial environment. You can't keep making the world safe Hummers at the expense not just of the lives of people who are sent to protect the lines of oil supply, but also the species that will go extinct when they're driven off mountaintops or the Arctic sea ice disappears. That's not leadership, that's greed. We have to go beyond that and find alternative ways to develop our economies so that instead of moving logs around on diesel trucks and big clunky machines around on our highways, we're moving electrons around on the microchips of computers, and we're using intelligence and information as a substitute for energy and materials. In fact, this is already evolving without help, but it's not evolving fast enough to prevent substantially potential dangerous climate changes, so we have to redesign our economies. It doesn't mean getting poorer, but it does mean redesigning who the winners and losers are. And not only do we have to protect the commons through less emissions, but we have to deal with the people who make the large automobiles, the SUVs. We have to deal with the coal miners, because they're not evil people. They're not doing these things to hurt the world. That's what they were brought up doing. But they can't keep doing it at the rate they've been doing it, or we're going to end up with unacceptable climate change. So we need to A, protect the commons, and B, out of fairness, deal with the people who hurt in the transition. That takes a new breed of enlightened leader, and I see some around, but not too many currently running governments.